The November fog came off the moors before dawn, thick and deliberate, pressing itself against the windows of Ashford Hall, as though testing the quality of the glass. It found the glass sufficient. It found very little else at Ashford Hall to be sufficient at all. And at the edge of the great entrance hall, where the chandelier had shed two of its crystals and no one had replaced them, counting the household accounts by the light of a single tallow candle, because the beeswax supply had not been replenished since September, was Clara Ashby. She was 24 years old. She had been doing this work, the counting, the calculating, the quiet emergency management of a house that was coming apart at its structural joints, for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She did not count the days from sentiment. She counted them because they represented the precise duration of her obligation, and Clara had always been careful about what she owed and to whom. The chandelier above her was Georgian, and the drawing room beyond the hall had been papered in a fashionable yellow-green that was now fading at the corners. The carpets in the main corridor had been turned once already to disguise the wear. In another season they would need to be replaced entirely, and there was no budget for replacement. Clara had written this into the accounts under a column she had labeled, with dry precision, Deferred Crisis. She was writing into that column now, her handwriting small and exact, when she heard the carriage. It was not the sound of the household's own aging barouche, which rattled at the left wheel and announced itself from a quarter mile. This was something heavier, better maintained, arriving without announcement, at 7:30 in the morning. Clara set down her pen, blotted the ink, closed the ledger, and went to the window. The carriage that had come to a stop on the gravel drive bore no crest she recognized at first glance. Then she looked at the livery on the 2 footmen who descended to position themselves at the door, and she understood immediately. She had seen that precise shade of charcoal gray, almost black, but not quite, described in the solicitor's correspondence that had arrived 6 weeks ago, and that her uncle, Mr. Gerald Ashby, had read once, declared unimportant, and placed face down on the library desk, where Clara had found it, and read it properly. The Duke of Renwick had arrived. Clara pressed one hand briefly against the window frame, and then went to put on a better dress. She did not have many. She selected the gray wool with the mended cuff, which was at least clean and pressed, and she pinned her hair without looking in the mirror longer than necessary. She was not beautiful in the way the fashionable world required beauty. She was not fair or soft-featured or arranged for decoration. She was composed. She had learned to occupy the precise amount of space she was given, and no more, and she had learned to look as though this were a choice. By the time she descended the main staircase, the Duke of Renwick had been shown into the entrance hall by Thomas, the sole remaining footman, who had the grace to look apologetic about the 2 missing chandelier crystals. The Duke was tall, that was the first thing. He wore a coat of charcoal wool that had been tailored with the kind of quiet precision that cost a great deal, and showed it only in the total absence of anything superfluous. No ornament, no flourish. He carried his authority the way a well-built bridge carries its load, without visible effort, because the structure beneath it was sound. He was perhaps 32, with dark hair and a face that had not been arranged for anyone's comfort. He was looking at the chandelier, not at the missing crystals specifically. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something when he is calculating the distance between what a thing should be and what it currently is. Then he looked at Clara. It was not the way men usually looked at her, which was to say they usually did not look at her at all, or if they did, it was with the mild, administrative gaze a person gives to a piece of furniture that is performing its function acceptably. The Duke looked at her with the measuring attention of someone who had noticed something he had not expected to find, and who was now deciding what to do with the information. "Miss Ashby," he said. Not a question. He already knew who she was. "Your Grace." She descended the final 3 steps with her spine straight and her hands steady. "My uncle is not yet risen. I am afraid he did not receive notice of your visit." "He received notice," the Duke said, 6 weeks ago. Clara allowed a small silence to occupy its proper space. "Yes," she said. "He did." The Duke looked at her for another moment, with that same measured attention. Then he said, "Perhaps you might show me the library." It was not precisely a question either. Clara turned and led the way. Her father had died when Clara was 17. That was the beginning of the particular geography that had placed her here, in this house, at this hour, walking one measured pace ahead of a duke who had more reason than he yet knew to be grateful she existed. Richard Ashby had been a gentleman of moderate means and immoderate optimism, which combination had produced 3 profitable decades and 1 catastrophic final year. He had inherited a small estate in Warwickshire, managed it capably enough to keep it solvent, and been persuaded at 61 by a man who would later prove to be a fraud that a wool trading venture in the north required only his capital and his signature to produce returns that would secure Clara's future and his own old age. The venture had required his capital. It had not produced the returns. Richard Ashby had died owing £4,200 to 3 separate creditors, having sold his Warwickshire estate to cover the largest portion, and still falling short. Clara had been in the room when the solicitor had explained the situation. She had been the one to take notes, because her father's hands had shaken too badly to hold a pen in his final months, and someone had needed to write down the numbers. She had written them all down. She had understood them completely. She had then spent the following 8 months negotiating with the 3 creditors, in the manner available to a young woman of no legal standing, which was to say, through letters that were precise, well-reasoned, and persistent enough that 2 of the 3 creditors had eventually accepted reduced settlements in exchange for prompt payment, rather than endure the administrative burden of chasing an estate with nothing left to chase. The 3rd creditor had been her father's cousin, Gerald Ashby. Gerald had agreed to forgive the debt on a single condition, that Clara come to Ashford Hall and perform, without salary, the work of managing his household's accounts and domestic affairs, for as long as he required her presence. He had presented this as an act of family generosity. Clara had presented herself at Ashford Hall 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago, with 2 trunks, a complete set of double-entry bookkeeping ledgers she had purchased with the last of her personal money, and the private decision that she was not going to become less than she was because the situation required her to make herself small. Ashford Hall had required everything she knew. Gerald Ashby was not a cruel man in the deliberate sense. He was inattentive, optimistic in the manner of men who have never been required to understand the consequences of optimism, and entirely confident that the estate managed itself. Clara had arrived to find that it had been doing precisely that, managing itself into a slow, structural collapse that no single crisis would mark, only an accumulating series of small failures, each of which was eminently fixable if caught at the right moment. She had caught them. The tenant farms on the eastern boundary had been running on informal agreements that had not been renewed or documented since Gerald's father's time. Clara had spent her first winter locating every family, confirming their tenancy terms, drafting new agreements that were fair to the tenants and legally sound for the estate, and having them witnessed properly. 22 agreements in total. Gerald had signed them without reading them, which had not surprised her. The estate's arrangement with the local wool merchant had been losing Ashford Hall approximately £60 per year through a pricing structure that had been set in 1798 and never reviewed. Clara had reviewed it. She had also reviewed the comparable rates being paid by 2 neighboring estates, which information she had obtained through the simple method of asking the housekeeper, Mrs. Briggs, who was on speaking terms with the housekeepers of both. Clara had renegotiated the merchant's contract and recovered the shortfall within 18 months. The house itself had required the most delicate management. The roof above the east wing had developed a slow leak that, if left unaddressed for another season, would require a repair that Ashford Hall could not afford. Clara had negotiated with a local builder, paying him in 2 installments, the second contingent on satisfactory completion, to address the structural issue before the winter of her second year. She had funded the repair by selling, with Gerald's absent permission, a collection of ornamental silver pieces that had been sitting in the butler's pantry unused since the previous century, and that no one in the household had noticed were there. She had done all of this, and more, without acknowledgement, without salary, and without the particular kind of recognition that would have allowed her to leave. There had been one moment, near the end of her first year, when she had been close to breaking. Not from despair. Despair required a kind of leisure she had not had, but from exhaustion. She had been sitting at this same library desk, in November, with a tallow candle and an account book showing a deficit she had not yet found a solution to, and she had sat very still for a long time, with her hands flat on the table, and thought about what it would mean to simply stop. She had decided it would mean becoming less than she was. She had picked up her pen and gone on. The deficit had resolved itself 11 days later, through a solution she had identified by going back to the original estate deed and finding an easement that had never been exercised, which she sold to the neighboring estate for the precise sum she needed. No one had known the easement existed. Clara had known because she had read the deed. Now she led the Duke of Renwick into the library of a house that owed him £11,000, and she placed her hand on the correct ledger before he had finished removing his gloves. His name was Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Renwick, and he had not intended to come to Ashford Hall himself. He had a solicitor, Mr. Edward White, who had been with the Renwick estate for 26 years and who handled, with considerable competence and no small relief on both their parts, the majority of matters that required human interaction in the transactional sense. Edmund was not, had not been, since his mother's death 9 years ago, particularly inclined toward the human world's social requirements. He fulfilled them. He attended what was required. He spoke when speech was necessary, and held his silence when silence was better, which in his experience was more often than people liked. The debt owed by Ashford Hall had come to him through the ordinary mechanism of inheritance. His father had extended the original loan to Gerald Ashby on terms that had seemed reasonable in 1819, and now, with the accumulated interest of 7 years at 3%, had reached £11,240. His father had died 4 years ago. Edmund had reviewed the estate's outstanding obligations at that time and made a considered decision to extend the repayment window rather than press a claim that would have resulted in the forced sale of Ashford Hall and the displacement of its tenants. He had not done this from sentimentality. He had done it because the alternative created more disruption than value, and because he had been, at that particular moment in the first months of managing a ducal estate that had its own considerable complications, more interested in stabilizing his own affairs than in collecting what he was owed. The report had come to him from Edward White 3 months ago. It had been triggered, as these things often were, by an anonymous letter, or rather, by a letter signed with the name of a man Edmund recognized as a creditor, currently attempting to acquire several struggling estates in the northern counties by purchasing their outstanding debts and then calling them in simultaneously. The letter had suggested, with poorly concealed eagerness, that Ashford Hall was on the verge of insolvency and that the Duke of Renwick should consider his position carefully. Edmund had asked Edward White to look into it. What Edward White had found had not been insolvency. It had been something considerably more interesting. The Ashford Hall accounts for the past 3 years showed a pattern of systematic, methodical recovery, not dramatic turnaround. There had been no influx of new capital, no fortuitous inheritance, no single event that explained it. What the accounts showed instead was the accumulated effect of perhaps 200 small, correct decisions, each made at the right moment and documented with a precision that Edward White had described, in the written report he delivered to Edmund, as frankly unusual for a household of this size, and frankly unusual for any household I have encountered in 26 years of practice. Edmund had asked who was making the decisions. Edward White had made inquiries. The answer had come back within a fortnight. A Miss Clara Ashby, the late Richard Ashby's daughter, who had arrived at Ashford Hall 3 years and some months ago, as a condition of her father's debt forgiveness, and who was, by all observable evidence, the reason the estate was still standing. Edmund had sat with this information for a week. He had looked at the accounts 3 more times. He had then instructed Edward White that he would travel to Ashford Hall himself for the quarterly review that was, in any case, already overdue. He had not told Edward White the other reason. 9 years ago, Edmund's mother had died. She had died in November, in a house that was too cold and too quiet, because the people who should have been managing it had been attending to their own affairs, and she had died without any of the small dignities that should have been available to her, and were not, because no one had been paying attention to the kind of invisible labor that made a house livable rather than merely architectural. Edmund had never forgotten this. He had never been able to articulate it to anyone in terms that did not sound like grief. which he was not willing to display, but he had never forgotten it. The accounts of Ashford Hall were, among other things, the accounts of a person who had been paying attention. Edmund found he wanted to understand how someone acquired that quality, or rather, how someone kept it, over 3 years of invisible work, in a house that had given her nothing in return. He stood in the doorway of the library for a moment before he entered. The room smelled of paper and tallow, and something colder from the window that was open a 1/4 inch despite the November morning. The woman who had led him here, Miss Ashby, with her gray dress and her steady hands, had gone directly to the shelves without hesitation and was already placing a ledger on the table, opening it to the correct page with the practiced ease of someone returning to a familiar instrument. She had not asked him what he wanted to review. She had simply known. Edmund Cavendish crossed the room and looked at the ledger she had opened. The entries were meticulous. The handwriting was small and consistent, with none of the decorative flourishes that some account keepers introduced. Purely functional, purely legible, every figure traceable to its source notation in the left margin. He said, "The tenant agreements on the eastern boundary. Were these your work?" She looked at him with a directness that he had not expected. "Yes, Your Grace. All 22 of them. There were 22, she said, at the time. A family departed in the spring of last year, and their tenancy was consolidated into the adjacent holding. There are now 21. He looked at her. "You drafted the consolidation agreement." "I did." He asked her 3 more questions, each increasingly specific, each about a decision recorded in the accounts that had shown good judgment about timing and priorities. She answered each one, without reference to the ledger, which meant she carried the information in her head and had done so for some time. On the 4th question, about the terms of the renegotiated wool merchant's contract, she reached past him to turn 2 pages back without apology, pointed to a specific entry, and explained in 2 sentences the reasoning behind the rate adjustment she had proposed and why the merchant had accepted it. He had not been near enough to the window for the draft. That small, close motion, her reaching past him to the page, had been entirely practical. She had not acknowledged it. He noted that she had not acknowledged it. He said, "Your uncle is not aware of the extent of your management." It was not a question, but she answered it. "He is aware that I manage the accounts, the extent of the decisions involved. He trusts that they are accounted for correctly." There was a precision in that answer that was close to being something else entirely, and they both understood it, and neither commented on it. Edmund looked down at the ledger. The current balance of the account showed Ashford Hall running at a modest surplus for the first time in its recent history. Not a large surplus, but a surplus, carefully built and carefully held. He said, "Miss Ashby, I would like you to explain to me the current position of the estate in full. I have 3 hours before I am expected elsewhere, and I would like to use them here." Clara said, "Then I suggest you sit down, Your Grace. The full position takes some time to explain properly." He sat down. She had not expected him to stay 3 hours. She had expected the standard review, the quick assessment of a creditor's representative confirming that the debt was being serviced, the polite assurance of continued forbearance, the departure. What she had not expected was the Duke's specific, patient attention to every figure she placed before him, his questions that went not to the surface of the accounts but to the decisions beneath them, and the quality of his listening, which was the listening of someone who understood what they were being told. She had not been listened to like that in 3 years, 4 months and 11 days. She had been useful before. Her father had relied on her completely in his final year, and had been grateful in the way that people are grateful to necessary things. But her father had not understood what she was doing, precisely, only that she was doing it, and that it was working. The Duke looked at the consolidation agreement for the Eastern tenancy and said, "You used the 1801 enclosure revision as your precedent for the boundary clause." And she looked at him and said, "Yes." And he looked back at the page with something in his expression that was not approval exactly, but was the recognition of a mind meeting another mind it had not expected to find here. She picked up her pen and went on with the summary. Gerald Ashby came down at 11 o'clock, found the Duke of Renwick in his library, and was immediately and effusively hospitable, in the manner of a man who had spent 6 weeks ignoring a letter and was now compensating. He invited the Duke to stay for luncheon. The Duke accepted without particular warmth. Gerald then turned to Clara and said, "Well, you can go and see about the arrangements," in the tone one uses to redirect a piece of furniture that has been standing in an inconvenient location. Clara closed the ledger she had been holding open, set it on the shelf at its correct position, and went to see about the arrangements. She had managed more difficult luncheons than this. She spoke with Mrs. Briggs in the kitchen, confirmed that there was adequate cold roast and a passable Madeira, redirected 2 of the household's 3 remaining maids from duties that were less urgent to the preparation of the dining room, and had the table set for 3 by 20 past 11. When she returned to the entrance hall, the Duke was standing at the bottom of the staircase, not in the library with Gerald, as she had expected, and he was looking at the wall, where a portrait of the previous century's Ashby patriarch hung. She said, "Luncheon will be ready at noon, Your Grace." He turned from the portrait. "Who managed this household before you arrived?" "A series of arrangements," Clara said, "none of them satisfactory." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that it would not carry to the library where Gerald was audible moving about, "How long is your obligation, Miss Ashby?" She had not expected the question. She had not expected anyone to ask it as though the answer were something he was concerned about, rather than merely curious. She said, "My uncle has not specified a fixed term." The Duke held her gaze. "I see," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that was heavier than the words themselves, like a stone, dropped into still water, the weight of it taking a moment to register. Luncheon was perfectly adequate. She ate very little of it. Edmund Cavendish returned to Renwick Hall that evening, and spent 2 hours in his study before Edward White found him there, which was unusual, because Edmund generally preferred to end his working day at 6. "The position at Ashford Hall," Edmund said, when Edward White had settled into the chair across the desk. "Tell me what you know about the legal basis for Miss Ashby's arrangement." Edward White told him. The arrangement was, as Clara had described it, informal, an oral agreement made at the time of the debt forgiveness, with no written terms, no fixed duration, and no specified compensation. In legal terms, it was barely an arrangement at all. It was certainly not an employment contract. It was more closely analogous to a form of indefinite domestic obligation, secured against a dead man's debt, and Edward White had clearly spent some time thinking about how to describe it to the Duke with accuracy, without editorializing. Edmund said, if the debt were discharged, her obligation would end. Edward White said carefully, "That is one interpretation." Edmund said, "Is there another?" There was a pause. "No, Your Grace." Edmund looked at the account summaries Edward White had assembled. Ashford Hall had been, at the time of his father's original loan, a modest estate with adequate land and poor management. It was now a modest estate with adequate land and, by any objective measure, exceptional management. Management that had recovered the estate to a point where, given another year or 2 of the same careful stewardship, it might reasonably be expected to service its debt at a faster rate. The recovery was the work of one person who had been doing it without acknowledgement, without compensation, and without a fixed term for her release. Edmund did something he had not done in 9 years. He went to the music room. It had been his mother's room. He had not entered it since her death. The key had been on his ring all this time. He had moved it from the original hook to his own ring on the night of her funeral, and had carried it without particular purpose for 9 years. He unlocked the door now and stood in the entrance while the room resolved itself around him in the dim light from the corridor. The pianoforte against the far wall, the music stand with her last composition still on it, the 2 chairs positioned near the cold fireplace where she had sat to listen to the estate's troubles and dispense advice that was, in retrospect, more structurally sound than anyone had known at the time. His mother had been the person who managed things. She had managed them the way Clara Ashby managed them, quietly, specifically, without credit, from the position of a woman whose intelligence had been allowed to operate only in the margins of the world she occupied. He stood in the room for a long time. He did not play the instrument. He had never played it. But he took the composition from the music stand and brought it to the light, and he read it. He had not known she had composed her own music. He had not thought to look. He returned to his study and wrote 3 letters. The first was to his solicitor regarding the structure of the Ashford Hall debt and a possible alternative arrangement. The second was to a woman he knew in London, a Lady Montrose, regarding a social gathering the following month that he had previously declined. The third was a brief note to Edward White, asking him to attend Ashford Hall again the following week on the Duke's behalf, and to bring with him the draft of a specific document. He stood at the window for a while after, looking out at the Renwick Hall grounds in the dark. Then he went back to the music room and locked it again behind him. He would open it properly when there was something worth opening it for. His intention had been to send Edward White. He went himself. He returned to Ashford Hall 8 days after his first visit, again without prior announcement, and again before Gerald Ashby had risen. The fog was less heavy this time, a clear November cold that made the gravel drive look sharp and exact. Thomas the footman admitted him, and Edmund was shown to the library without being asked where he wished to go. Clara Ashby was already at the desk. She looked up from her work, and he saw the small recalibration that crossed her expression, not surprise, precisely, but the adjustment of someone who has learned not to count on things that merely looked like constancy. He recognized it because his mother had worn the same expression in the years after her own position had become clear to her. "Your Grace," Clara said. She did not stand immediately. She blotted the entry she had been writing, and then stood. "I was not aware you were expected." "I was not expected," he said. "I would like to speak with you about the estate, and about a proposal." Something in her expression settled, like a door quietly closing. "A business proposal," she said. He nearly said yes, because it was the correct social answer, and because he had not yet decided how to proceed beyond the first part of what he intended. Instead he said, "To begin with." He placed Edward White's document on the desk. It was 2 pages, written in the solicitor's careful hand, and it proposed the conversion of the existing debt into a management arrangement, a formal estate stewardship position, with a specified salary, a specified term, and at its conclusion, the full discharge of Richard Ashby's debt. The arrangement would make Clara Ashby's role explicit, legal, and compensated. It would also require her to remain at Ashford Hall, or at another estate as specified, for 5 years. Clara read both pages without speaking. She read them in the careful way she read everything, all the way through once, and then back to 2 specific clauses on the first page that she read again. She looked up. "This clause," she said, pointing to the 3rd paragraph of the first page. "The management remit is defined as household accounts. I have been doing considerably more than household accounts." He said, "I know. The clause would need to be expanded. It would need to include estate agreements, creditor negotiations, and supplier contracts. If it does not include those, my position in any future dispute would be ambiguous." He said, "Edward White will amend it to whatever language is accurate." She looked at him then. "You would allow me to determine the language." "You already know what the work is," he said. "I do not." Something shifted in the room, not the theatrical kind of shift, not atmosphere, but the practical kind, the reorientation of 2 people who have each independently concluded that the conversation they are having is more important than they had each individually prepared for. Clara pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the ledger, and then set it flat on the desk. She said, "I would need to think about it." "Of course," he said. She thought about it for a moment, right then, in the silence of the library, which he did not fill. He waited. He was good at waiting. She said, "There is a second matter, isn't there?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then tell me the second matter before I decide on the first." That was the moment he understood, completely, what he was dealing with. He said, "The second matter is that I would like you to come to Renwick Hall, not as an estate steward, as an arrangement of a different kind, which I am not going to present to you in the form of a business proposal, because I think you would find that insulting." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You are speaking of marriage." "I am speaking of the possibility of marriage," he said. "I am asking whether you would be willing to consider it." "We have met twice," she said. "3 times, if you count the luncheon." She said, "I do count it." There was a pause. "Why?" he said. "Because Renwick Hall needs what you have spent 3 years building here, and no one is going to give it to you for doing it there either, unless the arrangement is different. And because…" He stopped. He was not a man who explained himself easily or often. He said, "You read the accounts the way my mother used to manage things, with the understanding that every small decision is load-bearing." Clara said nothing. Her expression was the particular stillness of a person receiving information they had not known they had been waiting to receive. Edmund said, "I am not asking you to decide now. I am asking you to come to Renwick Hall next month, for the winter gathering I have agreed to host, and to see what you think of it." She said, "As what?" He said, "As someone I have invited." She picked up the amended document and read the third clause again. "I will come to the gathering," she said. "The management arrangement, I will answer that when the clause is corrected." "That is reasonable," he said. She looked at him. His cravat had been tied that morning, she could see, with some attention to correctness, but the left side had slipped a quarter inch during the drive. It had presumably been that way for some time. She said, "Your cravat has been uneven since you arrived." He reached up without thinking. She took 2 steps forward and adjusted it herself, which took 3 seconds and required her to be close enough to see that his expression had changed in a way that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. She stepped back. "There," she said, and returned to the desk. Edmund Cavendish stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you," in a voice that was precisely controlled and meant rather more than the words. Lady Vivian Hartley was the daughter of the Earl of Creighton, and she was everything Clara Ashby was not, which Vivian was fully aware of and considered a complete summary of the situation. She was fair, beautifully dressed, and had been to Renwick Hall on 4 separate occasions before this winter gathering, and on each of those occasions she had conducted herself with the graceful certainty of someone who considers herself to be waiting for a formality to conclude. She arrived at the gathering with her mother, 2 evening gowns, and the absolute conviction that the presence of a Miss Ashby, who was, apparently a guest, was either a peculiar error or a deliberate social provocation she could not yet fully interpret. Clara had arrived at Renwick Hall 2 days before the other guests, at the Duke's invitation, to familiarize herself with the house. She had been shown to a guest room that was more comfortable than any room she had occupied in 3 years, and she had been met at the top of the main staircase by a woman named Dorothea, Dotty to everyone who knew her, the head housemaid, who had taken one look at Clara's traveling trunk, said, "Right then," and proceeded to inform her of everything useful about Renwick Hall that was not in any official account. The location of the warmest room in the East Corridor, which of the footmen was reliable and which was not, the state of the kitchen garden, which was, Dotty said, a complete disgrace, and had been since Mr. Horton the head gardener had retired in March and not been replaced. Clara had noted the kitchen garden. She had noted several other things. She had also spent an afternoon in the Renwick Hall library with Edward White, who had arrived the previous day and who received her with the particular warmth of a man who has spent 26 years managing an estate and has been quietly waiting for someone to manage it properly. He showed her the accounts. He showed her the outstanding supplier agreements and the 2 tenant disputes that had been sitting unresolved for 18 months. He did not explain what he was showing her, or why. He simply laid the papers on the table in a logical order and waited. Clara worked through them in 2 hours. When she looked up, Edward White said, "The East Boundary dispute has a precedent in an 1804 letter from the previous Duke's solicitor, if you know where to look," and Clara said, "Where do I look?" And he told her. By the time the other guests arrived, she had been in the house 48 hours, and she understood it the way she understood things, from the inside out. The first evening's dinner was a formal affair. 14 guests, 3 courses, and the collected aristocratic weight of the Renwick Hall social circle, which included 2 barons, a baronet, the Earl of Creighton with his wife and daughter, a member of the Renwick Estates Investment Council named Lord Aldridge, and several connected families, whose names Clara had read in the household correspondence, and could now attach to faces. She wore the grey wool again, because she had nothing better, and she was placed at the dinner table between Edward White and a retired naval captain named Pemberton, who was visiting on account of a land dispute with the Renwick estate that no one had resolved. She resolved the land dispute over the soup course, because the relevant clause in the original boundary agreement was one she had already read that afternoon, and Captain Pemberton was a man who was grateful for precision rather than offended by it. Lord Aldridge noticed this. He noticed it the way that men who sit on investment councils notice things, with the particular attention of someone calculating a variable. He said, across the table to Edward White, not quite quietly enough, "Where did Rennick find her?" Edward White said, "She found herself, my lord. His Grace merely had the intelligence to recognize it." Clara heard this. She did not look up from her soup. Lady Vivian Hartley noticed something different. She noticed that the Duke of Rennick, who was seated at the head of the table, and whose conduct at his own dinners was, by all previous observation, one of cool and equal courtesy to all guests, had twice in the space of the first course looked to the far end of the table where Miss Ashby was seated, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone not looking for it would have catalogued. But Vivian was looking for it, and she catalogued it. After dinner, when the women had withdrawn, Vivian sat beside Clara in the drawing room and said, with the pleasant, calibrated directness of a woman who has decided to simply know, "You manage estates, I understand." Clara said, "I manage accounts." "For whom?" "My family's estate," Clara said. Vivian turned her teacup in its saucer. "You are quite young to have acquired so thorough a familiarity with the Rennick accounts. Edward White barely speaks to anyone." Clara looked at her with the particular steadiness of a person who has been publicly diminished enough times to recognize the structure of it, even when it is delivered pleasantly. She said, "Mr. White speaks to people who understand what he is showing them." There was a pause. Vivian said, "I see," and the two words carried the particular quality of a woman recalibrating her estimate of a situation without being pleased about it. The third morning of the gathering, Lord Aldridge requested a meeting with the Duke regarding the estate's northern investment portfolio. The northern portfolio was one of three matters Clara had identified in the Rennick Hall accounts that required immediate attention. It was also the matter that concerned her most, because what she had found in the investment records was not merely a question of underperformance. It was a question of documentation. She had found the discrepancy on her first afternoon in the library, when she had been reviewing the estate's wool and textile investments, alongside the tenant farm income records. The returns recorded in the Investment Council's summary report did not align with the underlying contracts she had found filed in the back of the third drawer of the estate's document chest. Not filed, precisely, but placed there in a manner suggesting they had not been looked at since the previous Duke's time. The contracts showed profit-sharing terms that were materially different from the terms in the summary report. The difference was not enormous in any single year, but over 7 years it represented a cumulative shortfall of approximately £2,800 in income the estate was owed, but had never received. Clara had thought about this for most of the second day. She had thought about it carefully, because it was possible she was reading the discrepancy incorrectly, possible that there was a subsequent amendment, a renegotiated term, something she had not yet found. She had gone back through the document chest twice. She had found nothing to explain it. She had also thought about who Lord Aldridge was, and how long he had sat on the Rennick Estates Investment Council. On the morning of the third day, when Dotty appeared at her room door to say that Lord Aldridge had arrived at the library and was asking for the Duke, Clara took her annotated copy of both the contracts and the summary report, put it in the leather folder she had brought from Ashford Hall, and went downstairs. She arrived at the library before the Duke did. Lord Aldridge was already there, standing at the desk with an expression of confident ownership that belonged to a man who has occupied a position of institutional authority long enough to mistake it for competence. He looked at Clara the way men like him looked at women like her, with the reflexive assessment of irrelevance. He said, "Miss Ashby, I believe this meeting is for His Grace and myself." She said, "I believe so too. I thought I would place these on the table for His Grace to review before it began." She set the leather folder on the desk, opened it to the first page, and turned it so that the figures were clearly visible, and then she stepped back to the bookshelf, where she stood with her hands at her sides. Edmund came in, 2 minutes later. He looked at Clara, then at Lord Aldridge, then at the open folder on the desk. He crossed to the desk, looked at the first page for perhaps 15 seconds, and then looked at Lord Aldridge. He said, "Sit down, my lord. We have something to discuss," Lord Aldridge said, looking at the folder and then at Clara. "I don't understand what this," Edmund said. "The discrepancy between the contract terms and the council's reported returns. Miss Ashby has annotated both documents. I suggest we begin there." Lord Aldridge sat down. He did not look comfortable. Clara remained at the bookshelf. She had not been invited to leave, and she was not going to leave. She was the person who had found it, and she was not going to become invisible now. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Lord Aldridge produced 3 explanations, each of which collapsed under examination of the specific documentation Clara had assembled. He did not produce a 4th explanation. At the end of the 2nd hour, Edmund said, in the quiet tone of a man who has made his decision and does not intend to revisit it, "The council's standing composition will be reviewed before the new year. You will not be required at that review, my lord." He paused. "I think we are finished." Lord Aldridge left. He did not look at Clara on his way out. Edmund looked at the folder for a moment, after the door closed. He said without looking up, "How long did it take you to find this?" Clara said, "Parts of 2 afternoons." He looked up then. "In a house you have been in for 3 days," she said. The document chest was poorly organized. Then she said, because she was going to say it now, or not at all, "I would like to continue to have access to the library when this gathering ends." He held her gaze. "The management arrangement," he said. "Has Edward White sent you the amended clause?" She said, "He sent it this morning. The language is satisfactory." There was a pause that had a quality to it that was different from the pauses in business conversations. He said, "And the second matter?" She said, "I have been thinking about the second matter." "And?" She said, "I would like more time." He said, "You have it." She nodded, and picked up her folder and went to the door. At the door she turned back, because she had almost not said it and she had decided, in the 2 hours she had been standing at that bookshelf, that she was not going to be cautious about everything. She said, "Your mother's composition, the one on the music stand. It is in E minor. I recognized the key when I looked through the window." She paused. "You should open that room properly." Edmund did not say anything. He simply stood there, and the expression on his face was the one that a private person wears when something they had kept locked is recognized by someone who did not need a key. The gathering's final evening was a dinner for 20, with a reception beforehand in the main hall and an entertainment afterward in the music room. A recital arranged by Lady Hartley, who had organized these things for previous Renwick gatherings, and who had done so again this year, with the expectation that she would be thanked warmly, and that the evening would resolve several questions satisfactorily. Edmund's father, the late Duke's elder brother by marriage, Lord Francis Cavendish, who was not a duke but was the family patriarch in the traditional sense, and who had been included in the gathering as a matter of form, had spent the 3 days of the gathering watching Miss Ashby, with the expression of a man who is trying to find the correct category for something that does not fit his existing categories. On the 3rd evening, at the reception, he found an opportunity to speak with her alone, which he accomplished by the simple method of directing himself toward the section of the hall where she was standing, reviewing the placement of the evening's seating card arrangement. He said, "Miss Ashby, you have been very busy since you arrived." Clara said, "There was a great deal to attend to." He said, "So I understand." He paused. He was a man in his late 60s, with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in a world whose rules he had not written, but had benefited from. He said, "I want to be direct with you. Edmund he is not a man who makes casual invitations, or casual decisions of any kind." Clara said, "I know. The situation you have come from," Lord Francis said, "your father's debt, the arrangement at Ashford Hall." He paused again, which was not, she thought, from uncertainty. He knew what he wanted to say. He was deciding whether to say it with the civility it deserved. "I do not question your capabilities. What I question is whether a woman in your position is able to make a decision of this kind freely." Clara looked at him directly. She said, "My position is that I have been managing a declining estate for 3.5 years. That I identified a £2,000 discrepancy in this estate's investment accounts within 3 days of arriving, and that I have been offered a formal management arrangement with salary and fixed term by a solicitor of 26 years' standing. My position, she said, is considerably stronger than it was when I arrived. Whether I make any further decision from that position is mine to determine. Lord Francis looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who enjoyed being answered precisely when he expected to be deferred to. He was also, she could see, a man with enough genuine intelligence to recognize when he had been answered correctly. He said, "Edmund's mother would have liked you." He walked away without saying anything further. Clara watched him go, then returned her attention to the seating cards. Dottie appeared at her elbow from nowhere in particular and said, "Well done," very quietly, and disappeared again. The music room at Renwick Hall was larger than the library, and had been restored, in the 2 days since Clara had said what she had said about the composition in E minor, to a state that suggested someone had gone in, with attention and intention. The drapes had been opened. The pianoforte had been tuned. She could hear the difference from the doorway. The music stand had been moved to the center of the room, and the composition in E minor had been placed on it, rather than left in storage. Clara saw this when the guests filed in for the recital and found her chair. Edmund was already standing near the window. He did not look at her when she entered. He was watching the room, the way he always watched rooms, with the particular attention of someone who has learned that the important things are rarely at the center of the spectacle. The recital began with Lady Hartley's arranged program, a guest soprano, a young man with an adequate violin, 2 pieces for the pianoforte, performed by a professional musician Lady Hartley had arranged to attend. It was all perfectly adequate. The guests listened with the polite attention of people who appreciate entertainment in the way they appreciate a well-maintained road, without particular feeling but with an acknowledgement that it is better than the alternative. Then Lady Hartley announced, in the pleased tone of someone who has managed the evening to this moment, that the Duke's own pianoforte was the finest in the county, and that it would be a shame not to hear it properly, and that perhaps one of the other guests. Edmund said, "Miss Ashby." The room turned. Lady Hartley's expression rearranged itself with the smoothness of someone who has been trained to absorb social surprises gracefully. She said, "Of course," in a tone that meant nothing of the sort. Clara sat very still for a moment. She had not prepared for this. She had not been preparing to perform. She had been preparing to observe, which was what she usually did. She looked at Edmund across the room. He looked back at her, with the particular steadiness of a man who has made his decision and is prepared to stand behind it. He had opened the music room. He had had the pianoforte tuned. He was not doing this carelessly. She stood. There was a small sound in the room, not laughter, not a whisper exactly, but the social equivalent of recalibration, a collective adjustment of expectation. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and this room had been kept standing, though none of them fully knew it yet, by the woman who was now walking to the pianoforte. Clara sat at the instrument and placed her hands in her lap for a moment. She had been playing since she was 6 years old. Her father had given her lessons until they could no longer afford them, and then she had given herself lessons, using the music her teacher had left behind, and the structural logic of a mind that understood patterns the way other people understood conversation. She had played the Ashford Hall drawing room instrument on Sunday mornings, when Gerald was at church and the house was quiet, and she had composed nothing but had analyzed everything. She played the composition in E minor, the late Duchess's composition. She had seen it through the window of the locked room for only a moment, but she had read enough of it to know its structure, and she had a memory for music the way she had a memory for accounts. Exact, specific, indelible. The room was completely still by the 3rd measure. It was not a showy composition. It was not the kind of music that announces itself grandly and waits for applause. It was the kind of music that builds itself carefully, measure by measure, into something that the listener does not realize is remarkable until it is over, and then they cannot say exactly when it became so. It was, Clara had thought when she had looked at it for 30 seconds, the work of a woman who had been doing something quietly extraordinary for years. She played it through to the end. The room did not erupt immediately. There was a suspended moment, the kind that precedes something genuine. Then someone began to applaud, and then the rest of the room joined, and it was not the polite applause of an adequate performance. It was the sound of 20 people surprised by something they had not expected to feel. Clara set her hands in her lap again and did not stand immediately. She was not performing recovery from emotion. She did not cry. She had not cried in this room or anywhere near it. She was simply taking the measure of the moment, the way she took the measure of everything. Edmund crossed the room. He did not speak to Lady Hartley, or acknowledge the applause, or perform any of the social management that a host would normally perform in this moment. He crossed directly to the pianoforte and stood before it, and Clara looked up at him. He said, loud enough for the room to hear it, in the voice of a man who has made his decision and is now holding it in front of witnesses. My mother wrote that composition. It has been in a locked room for 9 years. I gave no one the key. He paused. Miss Ashby read it through a window in 2 minutes and played it from memory. I should like everyone in this room to know that, and I should like Lord Francis in particular to consider what that means about judgment and what it means about character. He looked at Clara. And I should like to say, in front of all of you, that I intend to ask Miss Ashby a question when this room has emptied, and that if she answers yes, you will hear about it soon enough. The room was extraordinarily quiet. Lord Aldridge was not in the room. He had made his excuses at dinner. Lord Francis was at the back of the room near the window, and his expression was the expression of a man who has spent 3 days recalibrating and has now arrived, imperfectly, and without warmth but without a— He did not smile. He nodded, once. Lady Vivian Hartley looked at Clara from across the room, with the expression of a woman who is not destroyed by what has happened, but who is, for the first time, no longer certain of what she had been certain of. She stood, after a moment, and began to applaud again, which was a more graceful response than the room had expected from her, and Clara would not forget it. The room emptied in the way rooms empty after something genuine has happened in them, with a quality of deliberateness, of people giving space to something they understood was not public business. Dottie appeared briefly at the door, assessed the situation with the accuracy of someone who has worked in this house for 11 years, caught Clara's eye, and smiled with a warmth that was completely unperformed. Edward White passed Clara on his way out. He did not say anything. He simply rested his hand briefly on the back of the chair nearest the door, which was as close as his professional instincts would allow, to the expression of everything he thought about what had just happened, and left. When the room was empty, Edmund stood at the pianoforte where he had been standing, and Clara stood beside it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He said, I told you I intended to ask a question. She said, You did. He said, Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or because your management of the Rennick accounts has demonstrated a value that justifies the social disruption. Though all of those things are true, he paused. Because you read my mother's music through a locked window, and played it back from memory, and because you have been the most careful person in every room you have been in since I met you, and because I think you have been managing crises before breakfast for so long that no one has had the opportunity to notice that you are extraordinary, and I would like to spend the rest of my life being the person who notices. He looked at her steadily. Will you marry me? Clara stood with her hands at her sides. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, from first principles, with the attention it deserved. She had been seen now. She had been seen in the specific way she had been waiting to be seen for 3 years and 4 months and, she supposed, considerably longer than that. She had been seen by a man who had opened a locked room for her and stood up in front of 20 people and said so. She said yes. He extended his hand. She gave him hers. He held it for a moment, her bare hand, no gloves in the music room, because she had not expected to perform and had not dressed for it, with the careful steadiness of a person who understands that some things, once taken in hand, are held properly or not at all. They were married in January at the Rennick Hall Chapel, with a congregation that included Edward White, Dottie, Captain Pemberton, and Lord Francis Cavendish, who attended in the manner of a man who has decided that the correct position is presence, not enthusiasm, and sat in the front pew with the upright bearing of someone performing a duty that has, over the course of several weeks, become something that is no longer merely duty. Lady Vivian Hartley sent a gift. It was a set of leather account ledgers, which Clara recognized as the kind of thing a woman might send when she has decided to be gracious in a way that also acknowledges what she cannot deny. Clara wrote a genuine note of thanks and meant it. Gerald Ashby accepted the formal discharge of the Ashby debt, with the understanding that the estate management contract he had been relying on was now, as was clearly the case, at an end. He hired a steward within the month, a young man who came well recommended, and who would, Clara suspected, find the accounts she left behind more organized than anything he had encountered before, or would again. The Rennick Hall accounts, in Clara's first full year as mistress of the estate, recovered the £2,800 of investment income that the discrepancy had concealed, renegotiated 3 supplier contracts, and documented the East Boundary dispute resolution in a form that, Edward White told her, could be used as a precedent document for similar disputes in the region. She kept the tenant farm agreements in a separate ledger, organized by boundary location and cross-referenced by agreement date, and she had begun drafting a framework for the neighboring estates, at their solicitor's request, that would allow them to audit their own tenancy arrangements against the same structural model. Edmund had a study, Clara had the library. These were the 2 gravitational centers of Rennick Hall, and between them ran the particular orbit of 2 people who have built something real together and know its weight. He came to the library in the evenings to read, and she went to his study in the mornings, when she had found something in the accounts that she wanted his opinion on, which was not every morning but often enough that the morning routine had settled into a thing that both of them relied on without discussing it. In the 2nd year of their marriage they had a daughter. They named her Margaret, for Edmund's mother, and she arrived in October with considerable determination and dark hair that would eventually resolve into something closer to Clara's own brown, but was, for the first year, an emphatic question mark. She was the kind of child who escaped cribs as a matter of principle, and was discovered, on more than one occasion, in the library at an hour when she had theoretically been put to bed, sitting on the floor with Clara's account ledgers arranged around her, in a configuration that bore some resemblance to a systematic organization. Clara and Edmund had an agreement about this, which was that they were not going to discourage it. The music room stayed open. Clara played it on Sunday mornings, and sometimes in the evenings, and Edmund read in the chair near the fireplace on the occasions when he came to listen, which was most of the occasions. He never said he came to listen. He came with a book. Clara did not point out that he never turned the page. On a Sunday morning in Margaret's 2nd autumn, Clara was at the pianoforte, and Margaret was on the library carpet in the careful custody of Dotty, who had become something between a head housemaid and a household fixture too essential to categorize formally. Edmund came to the door of the music room and stood there, as he sometimes did, not entering immediately. Clara played through the phrase she was working on, the late Duchess's composition, which she had been slowly annotating into a written form that did not previously exist, and which she intended to present to the small music academy she was helping to establish in the village, and then she set her hands in her lap. She said, without turning, "You have been standing there for 4 minutes." He said, 3. She said, 4. I counted. There was a pause. He came into the room and sat in the chair by the fireplace. He said, "The East Boundary Agreement. Pemberton's solicitor is asking for an amended copy." She said, "I made a copy yesterday. It is on the left side of my desk." He said, "I know. I found it." She turned then and looked at him across the room, this man who had done his research before he arrived, who had stood up in front of 20 people and named what he saw, who had opened a locked room and had never, in 3 years of marriage, once failed to notice her. He was watching her with the particular warmth of a person who has exactly what they want and knows it. Margaret's voice came from down the corridor, a sound that was partly determined exploration and partly the very reasonable expectation that someone interesting was nearby. Clara closed the music book, rose, and went to collect her daughter. Edmund was already at the door, and they met in the corridor with Margaret between them, small and insistent and dark-haired, reaching for the ledger she had apparently carried from the library under one determined arm. The fog had come in again off the moors. Inside Rennick Hall, every window was lit.